Walk through downtown Seattle today and you're walking 12 feet above the actual original streets. Stand in Chicago's Loop and you're standing on top of an entire city that used to exist at ground level. Go beneath Portland streets and you'll find complete storefronts, sidewalks and basements that haven't seen daylight in over a century. Between 1870 and 1910, nearly every major American city did something that sounds completely insane. They took their existing streets, raised them anywhere from 8 to 14 feet and built a new city on top of the old one. Then they filled in all the basements and first floors of the buildings that used to be at street level, buried them completely. The official story, flooding problems and sanitation issues, but here's what they don't tell you in the history books. The timeline doesn't make sense, the scale doesn't make sense, and the economic explanation they give you falls apart the moment you start asking basic questions. However, before we go deeper, if you're interested in the hidden economic forces that shaped America's infrastructure, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history and forgotten financial systems every week. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented history that just happens to be conveniently left out of every mainstream narrative about American urban development. Let's investigate what really happened beneath America's streets. Seattle is the most famous example because they turned part of the underground into a tourist attraction. But Seattle wasn't special. It was standard procedure. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, city planners decided to raise the street level by 12 feet. They told residents it was because the city was built on tidal mudflats and suffered from flooding. Here's the problem with that explanation. Seattle had existed at the original street level for nearly 40 years before the fire. If flooding was such a catastrophic issue, why did it take 4 decades and a massive fire to address it? And why was the solution to raise entire city blocks rather than simply improve drainage systems like every other coastal city in the world? The construction process itself reveals how normalized this was. Building owners were told to construct their new buildings with the first floor at the new street level. That meant their old ground floors became basements. Their old basements became sub-basements. For years, people walked on wooden sidewalks built at the new elevated level while the old sidewalks remained below. Eventually, they filled in the gaps, poured in dirt and rubble until the old city was completely buried. But Seattle wasn't alone, not even close. Chicago raised its streets in the 1850s and 1860s, decades before Seattle. The official reason? The city was built on swampland and needed better drainage. The solution? Raise every building in the downtown core by 4 to 14 feet. Some buildings were lifted with jackers while still occupied. Hotels continued operating while being physically raised off the ground. Think about the logistics of that for a second. You're running a hotel. The city tells you they're going to jack your entire building up 14 feet while guests are still sleeping in the rooms. And this was considered normal. Routine municipal maintenance. Atlanta did the same thing. After the Civil War, they raised the street level and created a whole network of underground spaces that are still there today. Portland buried entire neighborhoods. Salt Lake City raised its streets. Kansas City built a second city on top of the first. Cincinnati, Louisville, parts of Los Angeles. The list goes on. This wasn't a regional phenomenon. This wasn't a response to local conditions. This was a coordinated pattern of urban transformation happening across the entire country within a 40-year window. Now let's talk about the economics, because this is where the official narrative completely collapses. Raising a city's streets by 10 to 14 feet is one of the most expensive infrastructure projects imaginable. You're not just repaving roads, you're rebuilding every utility line, every water main, every sewer connection, every gas line. You're reconstructing storefronts, you're building new entrances to buildings, you're creating retaining walls to hold back thousands of tons of fill dirt. The cost in today's money would run into the billions for a single city. We're talking about an infrastructure investment that would make modern municipal budgets look like pocket change. And we're supposed to believe they did this to solve flooding problems. Here's what doesn't add up. American cities in the late 1800s were not wealthy. Most were recovering from the Civil War. Municipal budgets were tight. There was no federal funding for local infrastructure. Property taxes were the primary revenue source, and they were low by modern standards. So where did the money come from? The standard explanation is that property owners paid for it themselves because raised streets increase property values. But that explanation ignores basic economics. If you own a building and the city raises the street level, your ground floor is now a basement. Your main entrance is now below street level. Your storefront visibility is destroyed. Your property value just dropped, not increased. Why would thousands of property owners across dozens of cities voluntarily pay enormous sums of money to make their buildings less valuable? It makes no sense, unless there was something else going on. Let's examine the timeline more carefully. Most of these street raising projects happened between 1870 and 1910. This is the same 40-year period when the United States was transitioning from a primarily agrarian economy to an industrial powerhouse. This is when railroad networks exploded, when steel production went from almost nothing to dominating global markets, when American cities grew faster than at any other point in history before or since. The official history tells you this growth was organic, natural economic development, the invisible hand of the market. But the infrastructure tells a different story. Someone was coordinating these projects, someone was financing them, and someone had a reason to literally bury the evidence of what cities looked like before. Here's another detail they don't mention. When you go into the underground areas that still exist, the architecture doesn't match the timeline. The construction quality of many of these buried buildings is significantly higher than what you'd expect from hastily built frontier towns. Stone archways, brick vaulting, advanced drainage systems. These aren't the marks of crude 1850s construction. They look older, more established. Photographs from the 1860s and 1870s show the same thing. The buildings being raised aren't crude wooden structures. They're substantial brick and stone buildings with architectural details that suggest longer periods of development than the official timelines allow. If Seattle was truly founded in 1851, why do photographs from 1870 show it looking like a city that had existed for a century? The same question applies to Chicago, San Francisco, and dozens of other cities. The photographic record doesn't match the founding dates we're given. The architectural sophistication doesn't match the supposed age of these cities. Something is off. Now let's talk about what happened to the buried spaces. The official story is that they were simply abandoned, filled with rubble and forgotten. But that's not quite true. Many of these underground areas remained in use for decades after the streets were raised. Businesses operated down there, people worked in them, some even lived in them. In Seattle, the underground was used for storage, light manufacturing and less reputable businesses until the early 1900s. In Chicago, the lower levels remained active commercial spaces well into the 20th century. These weren't abandoned ruins, they were functional parts of the city that just happened to be below the new ground level. Why would cities go through the enormous expense of raising streets only to continue using the spaces below? If the goal was really to solve flooding and sanitation problems, why not actually abandon the lower levels? Why maintain them as active commercial zones? The answer might be that the buried cities weren't problems to be solved, they were assets to be concealed. Physical evidence of a previous economic and political system that the new industrial order wanted, erased from public consciousness. Think about what raising a city's streets does psychologically. It literally buries the past, makes it invisible, creates a clean slate. If you wanted to rewrite the history of American urban development, physically burying the old cities and building new ones on top would be a remarkably effective way to do it. And here's the uncomfortable truth that revisionist historians have been pointing out for years. The period from 1870 to 1910 wasn't just about economic growth, it was about consolidation of power, the rise of corporate monopolies, the transformation of American governance from locally controlled systems to centralized federal authority, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the standardization of time zones, the implementation of national systems that hadn't existed before. All of this required erasing local independence and local memory. What better way to do that than to literally bury the physical infrastructure of the old system and replace it with a new one designed for the new economic order? This isn't speculation. This is pattern recognition. When you see the same thing happening in dozens of cities across the country in the same narrow time window, with the same official explanations that don't hold up under scrutiny, you're not looking at coincidence, you're looking at coordination. The basements weren't filled in because of flooding. They were filled in because they were evidence of cities that existed before the official founding dates, evidence of construction techniques and architectural sophistication that don't match the frontier narrative, evidence of an economic system that predated the industrial corporate model that was being imposed from the top down. What's remarkable is how effective the burial was. Most Americans have no idea this happened. It's not taught in schools, it's barely mentioned in history books. The few times it comes up, it's presented as a quirky footnote about eccentric 19th century urban planning. But it wasn't quirky, and it wasn't eccentric, it was systematic. Go to any major American city and start looking at the architecture with fresh eyes. Look for evidence of filled-in windows below current street level. Look for staircases that descend into what are now basements, but were clearly designed as grand main entrances. Look for stone foundations that extend far deeper than necessary for buildings supposedly constructed in the 1870s or 1880s. The evidence is everywhere once you know what to look for, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. The official timeline of American urban development is a story written on top of buried truth. Literally. Seattle's underground tours have accidentally become one of the best pieces of evidence for this. Thousands of tourists every year walk through the buried city and are told the flooding story. Most accept it without question. But some start asking the uncomfortable questions. If this was really about drainage, why are the underground spaces so well constructed? Why do they show evidence of multiple layers of building and rebuilding? Why does the timeline not quite add up? The same questions apply to every city that did this. And the fact that it happened across the entire country in the same brief historical window isn't a coincidence. It's evidence of coordination, evidence of a plan, evidence that the history we're taught about American urbanization is incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. The economic implications are staggering. If these cities were older and more established than we're told, that changes everything about how we understand American economic development. It means the wealth wasn't created by rugged individualism and free markets. It was inherited from a previous system and then captured by the rising industrial class. Consider the banking systems that emerged during this same period. The National Banking Acts of the 1860s centralized currency control. Before that, thousands of local banks issued their own notes backed by local assets. After the acts passed, only federally chartered banks could issue currency. The old decentralized system was dismantled and replaced with centralized control. The physical infrastructure of cities underwent the same transformation. Local systems buried, centralized systems built on top. The railroad land grants tell the same story. Between 1850 and 1871, the federal government gave railroad companies over 175 million acres of public land. That's an area larger than Texas. These grants created enormous concentrations of wealth and power seemingly overnight. But here's the question. Nobody asks, how did the government have that much surveyed, mapped and legally documented land to give away if the continent had only been settled for a few decades? The answer is the same as the buried cities. The infrastructure already existed. The maps already existed. The legal frameworks already existed. They just needed to be transferred from one system of control to another. The street raising projects were part of that transfer, physical manifestations of economic and political reorganization. That's why the basements had to be filled in. That's why the old cities had to be buried. Not because of flooding, because of memory, because physical evidence of the old system would undermine the mythology of the new one. The mythology that America was built from nothing by entrepreneurial pioneers. The mythology that justified the concentration of wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. Look at what happened after the streets were raised. Property ownership became more centralized. Small businesses gave way to larger corporate operations. Local autonomy declined while federal power increased. The same pattern repeated across every city that underwent this transformation process. That's not coincidence. That's cause and effect. The buried cities represent a buried economic order, one that didn't fit the narrative of progress and industrial capitalism that was being written in the late 19th century. So they did what powerful interests always do when history contradicts their preferred story. They buried it, covered it with dirt and rubble, and built their new world on top. And it worked. For over a century, the buried cities stayed buried. The official history stayed official. But the evidence is still there beneath your feet in Seattle, Chicago, Portland, Atlanta, and dozens of other American cities. All you have to do is look down and start asking questions. If this kind of suppressed economic history interests you, I've got a video breaking down the real story behind the Federal Reserve's creation and the financial networks that connect directly to this. Click it now, and if you made it this far, subscribe. There's more buried history we need to uncover together.